Welcome to Ideas on Tap, presented by the Museum of Natural and Cultural History. I'm Lauren, and I'd like to start this evening by recognizing that the museum and the University of Oregon are located on Kalapuya Ilahi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. They continue to make important contributions to their communities, to the museum and the university, to Oregon, and to the world. We express our respect to the many more tribes who have ancestral connections to this territory, as well as to all other displaced indigenous peoples who continue to call Oregon home. If you're new to Ideas on Tap, welcome and thanks for joining us. Although we might not be together in person, we do still want to hear your questions and your comments. During this evening's program, you can use the Q&A and chat features on Zoom and Facebook to reflect on the talk or add your thoughts, to engage with other viewers, and to ask questions of our speaker. I'll be collecting your questions across both platforms, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. During the talk, I'll post a link to a brief survey in the comments on both Zoom and Facebook. Please consider taking a minute or two to fill it out, even if you've already filled it out before. Your feedback will help us improve future virtual programs, and you'll be entered to win a $25 gift card to Viking Braga Company, where the museum hosted our Ideas on Tap program prior to the pandemic. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we're asking that you please consider making a secure, tax-deductible donation of $5 to $10 at the web address listed on the screen to help keep museum programs like this one accessible to all. That's giving.uoregon.edu/MNCHgift. Your donation directly supports the museum's educational programming, bringing science and culture adventures to Oregonians of every age and in every corner of the state. Thank you. I hope you'll tune in next month on Wednesday, December 1st for another Ideas on Tap. I'll be joined by UCLA scholar Kirsty Francis for a discussion about magical women in medieval literature and magic's power to delineate and disrupt gender roles. I hope to see you there. Lastly, before Kirsty's talk next month, be sure to pop into the museum to see our latest exhibit, Magic in Medieval Europe. The museum is open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and until 8 p.m. on Thursdays. Come on in and check it out. Sorry, I am not seeing my stop share at the moment. There we go. I'm so sorry. All right, and now after that slight delay, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Chris Newell. Chris is a lifelong educator, a children's book author, and a multi-award-winning museum professional. He was born and raised in Madocmaguk, the Indian township in Maine, and is a proud citizen of the Passamaquoddy tribe at Indian Township. Chris served for 6 years as the education supervisor for the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center in Connecticut. Out of the museum, Chris and his museum colleagues co-founded the Akomawt Educational Initiative as a response to observations of the public school system and the lack of representation of Native history and social studies. From 2020 to 2021, Chris served as the first Wabanaki Executive Director for the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, Maine. And just yesterday, Chris's new children's book, If You Lived During the Plimoth Thanksgiving, was published. Congratulations on the new book, and thank you for joining us tonight for Ideas on Tap.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And thank you to the museum for the invitation. I just want to reiterate that if you do have the means to give, museums depend so much, to bring this programming, and as a former executive director of a museum, I would encourage you that little $5, might seem like not like much, but it really goes a long way. Thank you once again for the invitation to be here today. Today I'll be talking about my book, but really, I'll be talking some of the backstory of how the book came about. So, just to give you a quick view, the book is out, currently available right now at all major book retailers, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, Amazon, but you can also go to places like IndieBound, and you can find local book retailers that will have it in stock as well. So they might not have a website, it might be someplace you have to drive to, but depending on who you like to support, there's lots of places that there's availability, and that's one of the lucky things about publishing with a group like Scholastic. Now, I am a museum educator. I am not a writer. So this is my first book. The way this came about is really during my time at the Pequot Museum. I developed a program called Demystifying Thanksgiving. And the reason I did so is because, number one, I've lived in the southern New England area for, coming from Wabanaki territory up in Maine. I've lived in the southern New England area of the Dawnland, for the last 25 years or so. I've gotten to know many of the people here in this region, the different tribes. Many of them I think of as relatives. And, when I think about my Wampanoag relatives, my good friends, that have been around for so long, and I see their constant frustration, at the way, the Thanksgiving narrative is often taught about, and how it's so much weight falls upon them, to try to counteract and actually get true histories told about that period, the history of disease, the history of slave trade, war, other things that are associated beyond the Mayflower landing itself. When Scholastic approached me with this opportunity, this is a rewrite of a book, a 1970s era book, a series they have called If You Lived. So if you lived during the American Revolution, for instance, or the original book was If You Lived During the First Thanksgiving, I saw a great opportunity to take this history and really use Wampanoag people as the center of their own history, in the retelling of this, and find a way to really balance out the retelling of this history. So. But why this happened really began, before the Scholastic book. It really began during my time at the Pequot Museum. We were educating, and one of the things we were asked about a lot was the subject of Thanksgiving. In fact, we developed a museum program, a public museum program called Feast. Which happened, around the Thanksgiving holiday, and it was really me educating as part of the event about the history of how the Thanksgiving holiday came to be, and the food was all indigenous inspired, which would include no beef, pork or chicken, which all came with Europeans later. And so it was things like fish on the menu, and duck, venison, corn, beans, and squash, and we were treating people to really indigenous inspired menus, which would be more resemblant of what they actually ate at the feast in 1621. So there is truth to the story that there was, a Mayflower landing. There was an alliance that was created between Bradford's people and Usamaquin, who was considered Massasoit or Grand Sachem of the Wampanoag people at the time. But there's also some kind of glossing over of some of the other hard histories of how they got there. And also, sometimes we look at the Thanksgiving dinner that we eat now with turkey on the table, and kind of think that that's what they were eating at the time, when there's actually no record of that at all, And that's where I kind of get into, how the 19th century really affects how our modern day, assumption of the story really is created. So I have a short PowerPoint I'm going to share with you, and then I'm going to be showing some excerpts from the book and some of my approaches to how I approach this history. To give you some ideas, especially, as a native writer, a Passamaquoddy writer writing from a native perspective, even the title, if you lived during the Plimoth Thanksgiving, it's kind of funny. People who haven't read the book, in the pre-order session, as it was being advertised, I used the Plimoth spelling, which is what William Bradford used, and people freaking out and pulling their hair out in the comments that it's not spelled Plymouth, which is the current spelling of Plymouth. It kind of the whole point of choosing that spelling was to demonstrate that the English language is a foreign language to this land. It was not standardized in the 1700s, and there's multiple ways, to spell it, and they actually did spell it an alternate way. And then the use of the word Thanksgiving, days of Thanksgiving for the English in the 17th century were sometimes celebrations of victories in battle, which included in 1637 a declaration by the governor of the Mass Bay colony, not the Plymouth colony, but the Mass Bay colony, John Winthrop, after the Pequot massacre, declaring a day of Thanksgiving in honor of the massacre of 600 Pequot men, women, and children at the Mystic Fort. So why does this history mean something to me? Well, I am coming to you from Mashantucket, which is the oldest continuously occupied reservation in the country, and is the home of the Western or Mashantucket Pequots. My wife and children are Pequot, and so to have their histories included and told right, is something that something that is very near and dear to me. And especially telling the histories of not just their people, but all of the peoples in this region here. And so that's where a lot of this came about, was my time at the Pequot Museum and really working, telling Pequot history. And sometimes, how people conflate John Winthrop's declaration of a day of Thanksgiving with the Mayflower landing and kind of mix the two together. Sometimes people see that word Thanksgiving, especially Native people, and associate it with massacre. And one of the things in my use of it as a Native author and using it in the title was to reclaim the idea that the modern day Thanksgiving that we celebrate is actually more resemblant of Native traditions of annual Thanksgivings that take place throughout the calendar year. But let's backtrack a little bit. Let's go into my presentation. I will zoom through this and hopefully not take too long, and I'll give you some excerpts from the book. The way I frame this is national mythology through a Native lens, demystifying Thanksgiving. And so there's a reason why, because the first Thanksgiving narrative is actually a creation of the 19th century, well over 250 years after the feast at Plymouth in 1621. And it was created for a reason. So, founding myths, are something that are found in all cultures around the world, and America has some of its own. So how do they function? They're much like a creation myth. And I say that word myth, it's English is, and my language don't often jive very well. So people would call, the stories of my my people's creation myths as well, but when I hear that, I really just hear story, so that's my usage of it is really more revolved around the stories that are created. So much like creation myths, they describe how new realities came into existence, which creation stories can be part of. They justify established order and current state of affairs. So sometimes when we get to a certain point in history, governments get into the work of creating foundational stories of how they came to be, and the first Thanksgiving narrative is actually part of that story. They can explain the ethnogenesis of a group presented as a genealogy, and in America with a founding father, which is actually a reflection of England. England is a patriarchal culture. Many native cultures, over 1,000+ different cultures, so they're not all the same for sure, but many native cultures are actually matrilineal and trace lineages through women. For many tribes, they would actually describe a founding person as a maternal force, like the Sky Woman story that that many tribes in the Northeast are associated with. Or it can explain spiritual origins of a belief, philosophy, or idea presented as a narrative. So this is how founding myths function. Now, popular American founding myths, I'll just go through this really quickly, but of course, the legend of Christopher Columbus. I'm not going to talk about Columbus too much, but we do know that he was, the story was kind of glorified, and words added like discover, but how do you discover a place that's already occupied? We're getting much better at discussing the Columbus legend these days, but that is a version of one of America's founding myths. And another is Thanksgiving, and then of course, the usage of the term founding fathers in the writing of the U.S. Constitution. Mythologizing these gentlemen, as if they were, kind of like divine spirits in and of themselves, when they were in fact human beings, imperfect. And one of the beauties of that document is that it can be edited, and I think they wanted to make sure that was in there because they knew they did know everything. But Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving narrative that gets developed in the 19th century, this is a picture that's, I think the date is 1921, is really resemblant of how people have been viewing this since the 19th century, this story, very friendly story of, Pilgrims and Indians, right? That's the terminology being used, not even naming the tribe, but just Indians in general, getting together and, having a feast. And everybody getting along and everything was great, and then there's some additional detail about Tisquantum, usually called Squanto, teaching the Pilgrims how to plant corn, beans, and squash and things of that sort. But once again, there is actually more to the story, and then of course the idea of harvest. Now, the idea of a day of Thanksgiving to the English back in the 17th century, in the 1600s, was actually a day of Thanksgiving would have been declared, once again for maybe a victory in battle, but sometimes, for just a reason for need of prayer, to draw people to their covenant with God. And so a day of Thanksgiving to the English at that time period actually was a day of prayer and fasting. So this idea of cornucopia, and celebrating harvest and things like that, that's actually more resemblant of Wampanoag traditions than other, coastal tribal traditions in the area. June is the time when strawberries become ripe, and they have a strawberry Thanksgiving celebration. Cranberries in October, they have a cranberry Thanksgiving. Corn is ripe in August. That's one of the biggest celebrations of the year. So the idea of having harvest celebrations, as different foods became available, is actually something that's practiced by Native people in the region. A day of Thanksgiving for the English was actually a day of prayer and fasting. They did have a harvest celebration back in England, which they called Harvest Home, not called Thanksgiving. So there is something that does resemble this in the English culture, but it was not called Thanksgiving in England. That doesn't come about, once again, until the 19th century. Why? Largely because of this lady right here, Sarah Josepha Hale. Sarah Josepha Hale was the editor of a magazine called Godey's Ladies Book. She rose the readership of that magazine to 150,000 subscribers. And so it had a tremendous influence on pop culture in America. And for years, she wrote editorials that, because the Thanksgivings were happening, there were starting to be harvest feasts happening state by state by state at different times, and they were all happening around November, but it wasn't standardized, and they were having these feast meals. And Sarah Josepha Hale loved the tradition and wanted to standardize it and wanted to create a national holiday. So she wrote editorials in Godey's Ladies Book year after year after year, and eventually she wrote letters to presidents and got a letter to William Seward, who was the Secretary of State for Abraham Lincoln. And at the time, the Civil War, that wasn't called there at the time, it was the war between the states, was ongoing. The North had turned the tide and was winning. It was pretty determined that the Union was going to win the war. And President Lincoln was looking for something to bring the country back together. And so the first Thanksgiving proclamation is born out of that. And then the adoption version of the narrative of Pilgrim forefathers and things of that sort starts to become popularized and then taken up by fiction writers. I won't get into the timeline because I want to get into the book a little bit. So once again, in the book here, if you live during the Plymouth Thanksgiving, it's geared towards first to fourth grade. It's quite dense, I will say. It's 96 pages, but the format of it is a question and answer format. So if you look in the table of contents, what you end up finding is a list of questions, and I'm not sure if that's coming through on camera. It is a little bit, but yeah, in the table of contents you get a list of questions. And so if a student were to be using it, they wouldn't have to read the entire book to find a piece of information that they were looking for. And I'm the one that got to design the questions. And in my approach at designing the questions, one of the things I wanted to make sure people understood is that Wampanoag and native cultures that existed prior to colonization were just as complex, scientifically, governmentally, and in other ways, as the cultures that they were encountering that were coming from Europe. So when questions are asked, like how did the English preserve their history, which of course they did by writing down in books and on paper with and things like that. Well, the next question would be, how do the Wampanoags preserve their history? And then we start to talk about not just oral history, but the use of wampum, which, a big misnomer in America is that wampum is Indian money, when in fact shell beads that were often made into, mnemonic devices, pictorial mnemonic devices on belts. And they could be, declarers of war or peace, but they also signified values and truth. And they told stories, and there were people that had the skill of being able to read entire wampum belts, which would take hours at times because of the detail that was within them. The often big misnomer is that Native people had no writing system. What would you call something that is that exact, that somebody could look at it and be able to translate what is there? It's just not writing with pen and paper, but it's still achieving the same goal, and it's just as much detail. So I make sure that those things are asked on equal levels, for students, so that they are able to absorb these things. And then I challenge some things, so as I mentioned, I used the word Thanksgiving in the title, and in the book I end up challenging, is this even a Thanksgiving for the English? Do we even call this? It's not the first for sure. Days of Thanksgiving were actually practiced prior to the Plymouth colony in Virginia. It's just that because of the North, on the way to winning the Civil War, the foundational myth could not happen in Virginia. It had to happen someplace in the North, which is why the Plymouth colony got chosen. So that's where some of the questions are about. Who were the Pilgrims? Who else was on the Mayflower? Because there was more people than the self-identified saints who we know as the Pilgrims. Only less than half of them were the makeup of the people on board. The other folks, the saints, called the strangers. So the people on the board were actually quite diverse. It wasn't just religious separatists. It was folks that were also looking to come here for fortune seeking. The whole idea, in fact, of the Mayflower expedition was to go to Virginia, and they got lost on the way and ended up in Massachusetts. But to go to Virginia, begin a plantation, pay off the debt back to England, and then individual landowners would be able to make their own personal fortunes in their new plantation in Virginia. So it also gets into, the creation of the Thanksgiving holiday. As I mentioned, Sarah Josepha Hale is mentioned in there as well. And what is a Thanksgiving to English colonists? One of the questions I like to go into first is, I'll read for you, is the question of who were the Pilgrims? Because in modern day usage, when we refer to the Pilgrims, we are literally referring to everybody on the Mayflower. And I like to complicate that a little bit, because that's actually, once again, 19th century usage. that came about. So a pilgrim, who were the Pilgrims? This is how this one goes. A pilgrim is a person who makes a long journey to a foreign land, often for religious purposes. In 1608, a group of English citizens unhappy with the Church of England protested by leaving for Holland, present-day Netherlands, to practice Christianity freely as they chose. These people were known as religious separatists because of their wish to separate themselves from the large established organized churches of the time. However, life for the separatists was difficult in Holland. Many of the separatists also disagreed on how their religion should be practiced. As a result, a group of like-minded separatists made plans to leave Holland for the American continent. In 1620, 41 members of this group returned to England on a ship called the Speedwell. They had dreams of going to America. The separatists referred to themselves as saints. William Bradford, the future leader of their new settlement at Plymouth Plantation, was one of the saints. In his journal, which was later published in a two-part book called Of Plymouth Plantation, he called their journey a pilgrimage. When describing leaving England, he wrote, "They knew they were pilgrims and looked not much on those things, but lifted up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits." The term pilgrim referred to the 41 self-named saints until the 1800s, when it became common in America to refer to all passengers on Captain Jones' Mayflower as pilgrims, whether they were saints or not. And so hopefully by bringing this to light, it complicates the story a little bit for students. And then I spent a lot of time also talking about things, the first winter for those colonists was harsh. Half of them perished as a result. They arrived way late, November. They were not ready for the winter. They did not have proper shelter or proper food or anything like that. And so when it came to actual contact, which happens later in the spring, they were in dire states. Pretty weathered, starving at the time. So one of the questions I end up asking is what happens as a result? And I'm trying to find the question for you here. How did life change for the English colonists in Plymouth after they established contact with the Wampanoags? And so what this does, this particular question is kind of taking the perspective of the Wampanoags, and saying how did the Wampanoags end up helping, their survival? So how did the life change for the English colonists in Plymouth after they established contact with the Wampanoag? After Samoset entered Plymouth, everything changed for the English colonists. They no longer feared being attacked by the Wampanoags. They communicated and developed trade with each other. Many of the saints on the Mayflower had spent most of their lives in cities. Some of them knew more about buying food than about producing it. In Plymouth, however, everyone needed to produce all their food. Even with the corn they had stolen and the birds they were able to hunt, the colonists had barely enough supplies for the winter. Before they met any Wampanoag people, many of the colonists perished due to hunger, exposure, and illness. The colonists brought seeds from the plants that grew in England. However, they were concerned their seeds would not grow. After the alliance, they were able to trade for local indigenous seeds, corn, beans, squash, and pumpkins. Tisquantum came to their village and taught them complementary farming methods like planting corn in mounds with the beans and squash around them and using river herring as fertilizer. They also learned what other plants and animals in the region could provide food. This local knowledge was essential to the success of their plantation. Now, one of the things I don't center on too much is the feast itself, because the feast itself, which has been, so lionized and written about, was actually so unremarkable to the English that, only a paragraph or two exists from their point of view describing it. So I've spent actually very little time and talking about the feast itself, because there's very little description of what happened at the particular feast. And I try to make it more about the effects of, what was happening with colonization. So there is a pretext of, native country, suffering the Great Dying of 1616 to 1619, Patuxet suffering that epidemic, most of the village, over 80% of it being wiped out, and essentially the colonists finding an empty village and creating their settlement on top of that. And then of course the follow-up there was a term of peace that was created between Bradford's people and Usamakwen, that did last through Usamakwen's life, but then violence would follow. King Philip's War, which was, the uprising by Wampanoags and other tribes in the region, largely led by Usamakwen's son, Pulmeticom. And the violence that began that actually is tied to Miles Standish, who was a passenger on the Mayflower. So it's something that you can't divorce, from the Mayflower landing, the violence that would of colonization that would follow afterwards. So those types of concepts are actually talked about in the book, but done in a way that it gets us to a better understanding of where we as human beings, right? If we get rid of the labels of where we all came from and who we identify as, and just think of ourselves as human beings living in this territory, where we as human beings made the mistakes and admit them, and then learn from them so that we as human beings can do better going forward. Colonization has a side to it that has been popularly told, that basically would, some folks would tie the landing of Christopher Columbus to cars and cell phones, but it did so at the expense of 90+% of the indigenous population and indigenous territories that existed here pre-colonization. And that story needs to get told as well. Prior to colonization, there were 15 million native peoples approximately across the continent. By the year 1900, we're talking 250,000 native people in total in the United States left. Those of us that are here today are the survivors, or the ancestors of those 250,000 that survived those multiple hundreds years of genocide. And so our existence is resistance, and being able to take the narratives and center them around native histories, living native communities, being able to tell their own stories is one of the ways that we as human beings can do things a little better for each other. So with that, Lauren, I am ending my presentation right there, so I will be calling you back. I did pretty good on time for myself. Usually I go way over, so I'm patting myself on the back for that.
Well, so far, we don't really have very many questions. So I just want to remind people that if you do have questions for Chris, to please put them in the chat or in the Q&A. We do have one question. Oh, let's start with the most important question, which you did kind of mention at the very beginning. Where can we purchase the book?
Yeah, so like I said, you can purchase it at major retailers, for ease. Walmart, Target, Barnes and Noble, all are carrying it. BAM also has it. But one of the places you can look is a site called IndieBound, which will showcase local stores to you, local bookstores to you that have it in stock. And these might be stores that don't have websites, so they might be places you might have to call just to make sure and things like that. But it depends on where you like your money going. I will say that there, with the supply chain, disruption, that some folks have found that some distributors actually are having trouble keeping it in stock. So you may end up having to go to an Amazon or something like that that has a larger stock, but it is pretty much available everywhere.
And the museum does have an order placed, and possibly because of supply chain issues, they are not yet delivered, but due to arrive, and hopefully we will have them by late next week. So for anyone tuning in who's local and wants to pop into the museum store and pick up a copy, we hope that they'll be in stock like I said, by late next week. So someone is asking, what would you consider the most important takeaway from the book for the age group for whom it was written?
I think the most important takeaway, is that Wampanoag people get written about not just historically, but in the present tense, because that's especially in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut. And, when I moved from Maine down to this territory, one of the things I noticed is the amount of erasure, of Native histories in this territory. Connecticut, Massachusetts love their colonial histories. And one of the things that would happen when I worked at the Pequot Museum and it happened more than once, where a student or their parent even, would be in the museum, the tribal museum, being led by a Pequot educator, and would raise their hand and ask the question, are the Pequots still alive? And so that let me know that the public education system is completely failing, and so the fact that Native histories are often written by the things like the museum sciences, anthropology and archaeology will take and extract knowledge from Native communities, write about them from third-person perspectives, and that becomes the story, when there are living Native communities that can speak for themselves and tell their own stories and actually marry knowledge together with those sciences and actually build a much stronger knowledge base if that were to happen. And so often living Native communities are overlooked. And so that's one of the things that I think is the biggest takeaway from this book, is not only are you going to learn about this historical event, but you're going to learn about the living Wampanoag communities and how they are surviving, thriving, what they think about this particular holiday, because they don't celebrate it as a day of Thanksgiving. They celebrate it, or they don't even celebrate it. They call it a national day of mourning, because of the beginning. To them, that is the beginning of a long, 400-year genocide. So there is, Native peoples look at it in very, very different ways, and hopefully it'll help students, especially in America, get past the layer of the generalized English language terms that we use of Native American, American Indian, and start thinking about us differently. Wampanoag people, Narragansett people, Wabanaki people, we all have different cultures, and really start to think about Native cultures at that level. So I'm hoping that the starting, if they were to use this book, that as they go into learning history later on, the starting point for them is much ahead of where their parents' generation was.
Right, and kind of tying into that, someone is also asking what you would recommend for adults to read about this history. So maybe starting with your book, and then where could, do you have any recommendations for resources for adults past that?
Yeah, there's a great book called 1621, A New Look at Thanksgiving. There's also a book called Morning Road to Thanksgiving, which is a set of poetry by Larry Spotted Crow Man. So those are good Native perspectives, Native written books, on the Thanksgiving holiday from tribes in the northeastern region. So they're not necessarily as much historically based. This was a nonfiction historical book. There's a lot more in there about emotions and feelings, but that's how we find out about our humanity as well. So once again, an alternate look. One of the things I did was I sourced information in this particular book from a gentleman named Frank James Wamsutta. In 1971, he was invited to Plymouth, Massachusetts, for the 350th anniversary of the landing on the Mayflower. He's a Wampanoag, and they wanted him to give a speech. So they figured, hey, we'll hire a Wampanoag to give a speech, and Wampanoags are they must be grateful for everything that America has given them, and it's going to be glorious. And they asked to review his speech ahead of time, and he actually wrote about the history of colonization and the effect of it on his people in a very, very real way. And they wouldn't allow him to give his speech. It's now part of the Smithsonian collection, so you can view it if you want to go look it up. But one of the homages I did was a source information like from Frank James' press speech, where colonization and a colonized world would rather pushed that down and actively did so 50 years ago, that becomes now the source that people, their children are learning from. So it's a bit subversive, I guess you could say. But I did write the book with not just children in mind. I really wrote it also with the teachers in mind. How do the teachers teach the holiday better? Because in 2021, it's I'll tell you, as a Native parent, with kids in non-Native schools, it still happens where our children will come home during the Thanksgiving holiday with the paper headdresses and the paper bag vests with the fringe cut in them, to our shock dismay, in kindergarten and things of that sort. So those are practices that need to end, and teachers need better tools to teach the holiday with. And so, this book becomes actually a tool for them to teach the holiday better with as well. So, it does have appeal for adults, beyond, the intended audience.
Yes, definitely sounds like it's a book for all ages. So kind of building on what you were just mentioning right at the end there, someone is asking whether there are new traditions that could be added to the common American Thanksgiving to recognize this history more accurately and appropriately.
Well, one of the things I would do is let's stop putting the first Thanksgiving narrative out there and associating it with the modern day Thanksgiving holiday. That's one of the things that you'll get from this book, is that they are two separate things. And it was really, as I mentioned, a kind of a propaganda plan as a way to bring the country together to adopt this myth. When it comes to the Thanksgiving holiday that we celebrate today, there's nothing wrong with enjoying football, but there's also no reason that you have to, have Indians and Pilgrims be the centerpiece of your Thanksgiving feast. That's one of the things we can change. We can definitely celebrate a Thanksgiving, because what is a Thanksgiving in 2021, right? That's kind of subjective. Is it a harvest feast? Because not all of us farm these days. So is it truly a harvest feast for us anymore? Is it a day for family just to get together? If that's all it is for you, and and that's good enough, then that's what it is. That's what it is for my family. We're Passamaquoddy, and my mom is non-Native. For us, it is a family gathering. It's a time for us to get together. We do have turkey. We do enjoy it, and things of that sort. But, we don't pay homage to the narrative, when we do so. So yeah, if it is about football, if it is about family gathering, let it be about that. There's nothing extra you have to do. But one of the things I would do is, if you find somebody, pulling in the Pilgrim Indian narrative, have them question it a little bit, complicate it for them, what I tell people is that, with the work that I do, all I can do is arm people with information, and then they go and do with it what they will. And then my hope is that, in the end, I would contribute to a better, more informed world. And that's the idea, is that the conversations at these Thanksgiving dinners maybe would be more informed, with just better language, being used, and we're all talking about things at kind of a higher level.
So I know you mentioned that the book doesn't get into the feast too much, but someone is asking for a little bit of clarification. It says, it sounds like the feast, when it did occur, did not occur until after the first hard winter, and until not the spring afterwards. And they're asking for a little bit of clarification on that timeline.
It actually would be the fall of that year. Yeah, it was around September, yes, they had just brought in their crops, so just after the harvest season. And the English on their own, they didn't invite anybody. The English on their own decided to have a feasting celebration, to celebrate, and that the fact that they had enough food to get through the upcoming winter. So imagine what they had gone through, right? And then they did all of this work, and they're rewarded with enough food to get through the winter. So they made a big deal out of it. They had a big party. They were very happy and one of the things that ended up happening is they did things like fire their guns, which kind of alerted the Wampanoags a little bit. They're like, why are these guys so riled up? So Osamakwen actually shows up at the village with 90 men, which to me, and Wampanoag people that read it, that tell me about it, that's actually more of a fighting force. That's not necessarily a friendly gathering happening, but everybody kind of figures out that nothing is amiss or awry, and the alliance is upheld, and the English say, okay, why don't you stay instead? The Osamakwen looks and says, you don't have enough food for all of us, and sends his men out, and they kill 5 deer. So venison becomes part of the menu. The English send their hunters out, and they go what they call fowling, which at the time is debatable. The most likely usage was they were hunting water birds, but it could have we also see usage of it as just hunting birds. So maybe turkey was there, but it doesn't mention turkey in specifics, only that the English went fowling. So we know some sort of bird or water bird was on the menu as well. So those are the things that we do know. I mean, they were likely eating things like fish that were available during that time of year. Cranberries definitely, and maybe even things like American eel, which was actually a staple food before we destroyed the river systems and destroyed their natural habitat. The American eel existed all up and down the eastern seaboard and was a major food source for Native peoples who depended upon their runs every year, and they would have been doing their late summer run earlier in that year, and would have been harvested, and likely there would have been some of that left over as well. So it's not even known if Wampanoag women were there or not. I mean, you could surmise they probably were, because it lasted for 3 days. So if the celebration was lasting, likely they felt welcome enough that the women would end up showing up. But there's like I said, so little known. The English barely wrote about it, and it wasn't until Alexander Young, I believe the year is 1841, who finds William Bradford's manuscript 200 plus years after it just disappeared completely, and then 200 plus years later he finds it, reads a letter from Edward Winslow that describes the feast, and in the footnote in Alexander Young's book describes the feast as the first Thanksgiving, in reference to the 19th century tradition of having a harvest feast with turkey on the table and things of that sort. So it's kind of a misunderstanding on Alexander Young's part that this feast was a Thanksgiving, but that's how it became known as the first Thanksgiving. I actually call it in the book a mistake of history.
So someone, you mentioned this, but someone's asking just if you could talk a little bit more about the indigenous population that was living in the Plymouth area when the Mayflower arrived.
Sure. So prior to the Mayflower arrival, Wampanoag peoples are not just one people, right? The Pokanoket village was the kind of they're a loosely confederated group of people who speak the same language and follow a governmental body that recognizes Pokanoket as basically the chair of power. So there's multiple villages all throughout the region, and then out on Cape Cod there are the Nauset people. There's to the west of the Wampanoag, there are the Narragansett on the coast. To the inland areas, there are Nipmuc peoples, which are the people of the fresh water. To the north would be the Abenaki or Abenaki peoples, and these tribes that you start getting into, and also the Massachusetts people, that exist just north of them as well. So those are the different tribes that exist in the region. They all speak related languages. They're all part. There's a larger language family called Algonquin, and so all of these tribes speak various dialects or versions of Algonquin, and they're close enough that they could be able to speak and trade with one another. In fact, Wabanaki peoples, our languages, they're different, but we were able to come down all the way to Wampanoag territory where were able to make wampum beads, which come from quahog shell and channeled whelk. We don't have quahog way up in northern Maine, but we have wampum belts to preserve our history. We were coming all the way down to that territory, sometimes journeys of 1,000 miles, and able to trade, because of the similarities through Algonquin dialects. So there were ways for people to, get along diplomatically, and a lot of it was done actually through the use of wampum and the recognition of certain ways of leadership. One of which was consensus-based leadership, which is very different than democracy. Democracy has, great points to it in that majority gets to decide. But in a democracy, if it's a close vote, 49% are unhappy with the final decision. In consensus-based voting, it takes longer, but in the end, all of the leaders come to a common understanding and decision and all agree upon it. But one of the things that happens with colonization is you have a loss of time. You don't have that luxury anymore to gain consensus. And so decision-making actually for Native peoples gets disrupted by the effects of colonization, and then of course, the democratization of the area that would follow.
Thank you. So building on, going back a little bit to the traditional fall harvest, what foods would the local coastal indigenous people near Plymouth at the time have eaten at their traditional fall harvest?
So the biggest one would be the Feast of Green Corn. So the corn, beans, and squash. If you eat corn, one of the things in New England, that New Englanders do is around this time of year, around Halloween, they put up colored corn on their doors, and they call it Indian corn. What I tell people is that all corn is Indian corn because it was developed here in the Americas, and it was actually it was refined. This method of complementary farming of farming corn, beans, and squash together in Central America at 2 different times in 2 different locations, and then spreads north and south. And corn is a plant that would not survive without human cultivation. That technology of growing corn, beans, and squash together complementary, causes your soil to yield bigger vegetables, less deterioration of the soil, all types of things, better water usage. It was a masterful way, and not to mention, if you eat corn, beans, and squash, you're meeting all of your nutritional needs. So it's actually, that's all you would need to eat to survive even. So agricultural cultures start to spread the technology all through the Americas, through the American Southwest, up into the plains, and eventually it makes it into the Northeast right about 1,000 years ago. So corn, beans, and squash were definitely, by the time, staple foods of the people, and largely produced by the women. That's one of the cultural differences between the English versus the Native peoples of the region, is that especially for Wampanoag people, women did all the farming, and English people would write about it. And that's one of the things you got to take English sources, you got to kind of take them with a grain of salt because of their perspective. They would write about the men as being lazy because they would see the women doing all the farming and the men were doing hunting and fishing. Now, to the English, hunting and fishing are leisure activities, right? They imagine the dogs going out and knocking the quails, and they're, that's what they did for fun, not necessarily for survival. Farming is what they did for survival. That was considered hard work. But the reason why women would take that over is because they're producing 75% of the food for the village. And so therefore, even though they are not typically chosen as sachems, they are occasionally, there are what the English would call squaw sachems, which are women sachems, but men are typically chosen as sachems. The women, because they're producing 75% of the food, have a tremendous political influence on the leadership of the village. And so why would they give that power up? Right? Why would they give that to the men, when they have all of that? And so they took it upon themselves, not to mention it fit culturally as well, because Native, land stewardship, teaches that humanity is part of a process of stewarding land to actually get it to yield more, a fruitful landscape. And that's what, Verrazano, when he ran into the territory, ran into was, he described the land as looking, fruiting trees everywhere. It looked like manicured landscape. All the underbrush was burned out. There was foraging plants everywhere. They had everything that they needed, and it was definitely not wild, overgrown, bush forest, as the way Native people took care of it. So those are some of the major differences, that were happening culturally. And for Wampanoag women, once again, it was just something the English would have to get used to. And even when the idea of land ownership finally takes hold as the English start to dispossess land, the land owners for women in these tribes in this region were actually, the landowners for the tribes in this region were actually the women. And once again, the use of squaw sachem is commonly seen in English documentation because they're trying to buy land from the women who are not giving it up. They're handing it down through, they start to use the English laws, and they create wills, and they hand it down to their daughters to make sure it stays within their hands. So there's interesting ways of resistance, through colonization, that Native people would take over, for survival reasons, and a lot of change, as a result of the disruption of colonization.
So does your book get into like the hostilities between the Wampanoag and the English people? And if so, or would you like to share some of that with?
There's definitely, I definitely talk about that. Like I said, you can't divorce King Philip's War, which was the last gasp of indigenous resistance in the area, and largely led by Wampanoag peoples against English over occupation of the territory. So that's I'm sorry, what was your question again? I was looking at
someone is just asking if you could talk more about that, and so if you and then yes, I do talk about the violence between the English, and then of course there's the Pequot War, which happens in 1636 to 1638. It's the first war of aggression against Native people that happens in the Connecticut colony. But I also talk about the Great Dying that preceded it. I also talk about the 100 years of fishermen, coming on shore, passing on disease, capturing slaves. Tisquantum was captured as a slave, and that's how he learned the English language. Samoset, also learned English from trading with English mariners. So there's a kind of a complicated relationship of love, hate, and betrayal and trust, with early contact that had been happening for well over 100 years before the Mayflower even landed. So that's one of the things that I really get into as well, to try to get rid of this notion that the Mayflower landing is the touch point of the beginning of the arrival of colonists, when it's not. There was a whole lot of contact that happened well before that. And by the time of the Mayflower landing, Wampanoag people were definitely at odds with the English. But what would happen, the Great Dying stopped in Wampanoag territory and did not affect the Narragansett people. The Narragansett people were actually pressuring Usamakwen's people for payments of tribute of wampum, to hold on to their territory. And Usamakwen, with the massive loss of life of his people, was not able to occupy his territory fully and was in danger of losing it. And so therefore saw the need to ally with Bradford's people, who had metal guns, and they knew about guns and knew the power of them, and they made that alliance that they would protect each other against aggression. So if the Narragansetts did get aggressive, then the English would step in with their guns and they would help. And that's one of the reasons why that alliance happened. But as I mentioned very early, Usamakwen took a lot of heat from a lot of other Wampanoag sachems who did not like his alliance with the English because of their history of violence. That's and as soon as Usamakwen dies, the alliance that was made breaks down very, very quickly. Well, we're coming up on the close of time, so we're going to end with one more question. As an Indigenous museum professional, what are the biggest issues facing museums who are trying to recenter these stories and histories?
This could be a whole new webinar right here.
Yeah, it could be a whole nother hour.
Yeah.
Another week.
But I will say, museums are making the turn. One of the things I would probably talk about is, one of the things that frustrates me a bit is the speed at which some, the turn, especially some of the larger major institutions, they see the problem, but yet, are very, loath to make the turn. And that's, part of it, I think, is the structure of museums themselves. The board structure in and of itself sometimes can be inhibit the process of museums in their work to decolonize themselves. And and just a real quick on the note of a colonial museum decolonizing itself, that's not a goal, it's a process, because a colonial museum will never fully decolonize. That's one of the things I always taught at the Abbey, that we would never fully decolonize because we are an artifact of colonization. But museums really do need to modernize their thinking, and it really needs to happen not just at the curatorial level, which is where a lot of the energy is right now. It needs to happen at the decision-making level, where people have to go to get the funding and get the jobs created to get this work done, to speed up the process. And so that's probably, I think, the biggest inhibition, I think, is just the structure of museums currently, and sometimes how that gets in the way of change, positive change.
Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Chris. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in for coming and listening to your presentation. Everyone's giving you a big round of applause right now, even though it's just the two of us in the webinar.